Chapter 6. Beyonder. Not only did they speak the same Loan language, but they also shared the same grim and tense vibes. Where am I? What do I plan to do here? I would like to know, too. Calming himself down, Zhou Mingrui silently repeated the questions posed by the two. What left the deepest impression on him wasn't the sentences formed by words, nor the meanings behind them, but the bewilderment, vigilance, panic, and reverence shown by the couple. For some baffling reason, these two people had been mysteriously dragged into this world surrounded by gray fog. Zhou Mingrui, the one responsible, was already feeling abnormally dumbfounded and startled, let alone the couple, who had been pulled into this mess completely passively. For them, such events and encounters might already be beyond their wildest imaginations. Zhou Mingrui quickly considered his options. The first was to feign victimhood, hide his true identity, and gain trust. He could then take a wait-and-see approach and take advantage of his circumstances when necessary. The second option was to maintain his mysterious identity in their eyes and affect the course of events while gathering valuable information from them. With no time to hesitate, Zhou Mingrui latched on to the thought that flashed through his mind. He made his decision. He would go with the second option, exploit their psychological state to gain the greatest advantage. After a few seconds of silence in the fog, Zhou Mingrui chuckled. In a low, calm tone, he spoke as though responding to polite greetings. An attempt. Audrey Hall looked at the mysterious figure veiled in the grayish-white fog. The only thoughts running through her mind were how absurd, funny, horrifying, and weird the situation was. Just moments ago, she had been at her dressing table in her bedroom, but by simply turning around, she had somehow arrived in this place filled with gray fog. How inconceivable. Audrey took a breath and put on an impeccable, courteous smile. In a somewhat perturbed tone, she asked, "Sir, is the attempt over? Might you permit our return?" Alger Wilson had similar intentions of probing Zhou Mingrui, but his experience made him more reserved. He held back and remained a silent onlooker. Zhou Mingrui turned his attention to the girl. Through the mist, he could make out her silhouette, a tall girl with smooth blonde hair, but her features were unclear. He didn't rush to answer. Instead, he turned to look at the man with messy dark blue hair and an average stature. Suddenly, a realization hit Zhou Mingrui. As he became stronger or gained a deeper understanding of this foggy world, perhaps he would be able to see through the fog and discern their faces more clearly. In this situation, they were the visitors, and he was the master. This change in mindset led Zhou Mingrui to notice details he hadn't picked up on before. Both the girl and the man looked somewhat incorporeal, their figures tainted by a faint crimson hue. They resembled projections, drawn from the two crimson stars that existed beyond the gray fog. These projections were based on an intangible connection, one that only he could grasp. The connection could be severed, and the couple would return to their world. Zhou Mingrui nodded mildly and turned back to the girl. Chuckling softly, he said, "Of course, if you make a formal request, you can return right this moment." Hearing no ill intent in his voice, Audrey sighed in relief. She believed that a gentleman capable of such miraculous things would surely honor his word. Feeling reassured, she surprised herself by not requesting to leave immediately. Her eyes gleamed with curiosity as she rolled them left and right. This is such a wonderful experience. Yes, I've always hoped for something like this to happen. I like mysteries and supernatural miracles. No, what I mean is, sir, how can I become a Beyonder? As she spoke, her excitement grew, causing her to stumble over her words. The dream she'd nurtured from childhood, inspired by thrilling stories from her elders, suddenly seemed possible. In her excitement, all her previous fears had melted away. Good question. I'd like to know the answer myself, Zhou Mingrui thought wryly. He pondered how to respond, determined to maintain his mysterious image. At the same time, he felt standing during the conversation was inappropriate. Shouldn't he be in a palace, sitting at the head of a long table, on a high-backed chair engraved with ancient patterns, observing his visitors? As soon as this thought crossed his mind, the gray fog began to churn. Audrey and Alger both flinched in shock. In an instant, they saw towering stone pillars around them, and above was a vast dome enclosing the area. This edifice was magnificent, grand, and lofty, like the legendary palaces of giants. Beneath the dome, where the gray fog gathered, a long bronze table appeared with 10 high-backed chairs on either side. Each chair glowed faintly with crimson, forming strange constellations that differed from reality. Audrey and Alger sat across from each other, next to the seat of honor. Audrey glanced around, unable to suppress her awe. How fascinating. It certainly is, Joe Mingrui thought as he ran his fingers along the edge of the bronze table, maintaining his calm expression. After a few moments of silence, Alger spoke up, answering Audrey's earlier question. If you want to become a Beyonder, join the churches of the Evernight Goddess, the Lord of Storms, or the God of Steam and Machinery. The majority of people will never encounter a Beyonder in their lifetime. This scarcity has caused even some clergymen to doubt their existence, but I can assure you, Beyonders still exist in courts, tribunals, and execution agencies. They continue to fight the dangers that lurk in the shadows, though their numbers are far fewer than they were during the early days of the Iron Age. Joe Mingrui listened attentively, but tried his best to appear indifferent, as if he were casually listening to children tell stories. Relying on Klein's fragmented knowledge of history, he knew that the Iron Age referred to the current Fifth Epoch, which had begun 1,349 years ago. Audrey sighed softly after listening. Mister, I know what you've just said. I even know more than that, about the Nighthawks, the mandated Punishers, and the machinery hive mind. But I don't want to lose my freedom. Alger let out a low laugh before replying vaguely, You can't become a Beyonder without sacrifices. If you don't want to join the churches or accept their challenges, your only options are to seek out royal families or nobles with ancient lineages, or risk finding clandestine evil organizations. Audrey puffed her cheeks slightly, glancing around nervously. After confirming neither Alger nor Joe Mingrui noticed her reaction, she pressed, Are there no other solutions? Alger fell into silence. After about half a minute, he turned to look at the mysterious man who had been observing them in silence. Realizing Joe Mingrui had no intention of answering, Alger turned back to Audrey and said slowly, I have 2 sets of Sequence 9 potion formulas. Sequence 9? Joe Mingrui muttered to himself. Really? Which 2 sets? Audrey asked, her voice filled with excitement. Clearly, she understood the significance of Sequence 9 potions. Alger leaned back slightly, speaking in an unhurried tone. As you know, humans can only become Beyonders by relying on potions. The names of these potions come from the blasphemy slate. After being translated through Jotun, Elvish, Ancient Hermes, and Faesac, the names have changed over time. The essence, however, lies not in their names, but in their core characteristics. The first Sequence 9 potion I have is called Sailor. It grants excellent balance. Even in a storm on a boat, you'll walk as though you're on land. You'll gain immense strength, and your skin will develop illusory scales that make you difficult to catch. You'll be able to swim like a fish and remain underwater for at least 10 minutes without equipment. Sounds impressive? Keepers of the Seas from the Lord of Storms? Audrey guessed. It was called that in the past, Alger confirmed before continuing. The second Sequence 9 potion is called Spectator. Although I'm unsure what its original name was, this potion sharpens your mind and gives you keen observational abilities. Just like a theater spectator, you'll watch the actors in the world and glimpse their true thoughts through their actions and emotions. At this point, Alger added, Remember, whether you're at an extravagant banquet or on a crowded street, a spectator must remain just that, a spectator. Audrey's eyes sparkled as she listened. After a moment, she asked, Why? All right, I'll save that question for later, but I think I've fallen in love with the idea of being a spectator. How can I get the formula for this potion? What can I offer in exchange? Alger, clearly prepared for this, replied in a deep voice, The blood of a ghost shark, at least 100 milliliters. Audrey nodded eagerly, then hesitated. But how would I give it to you? And how can you guarantee I'll get the formula in return? How do I know it will be authentic? Alger answered calmly, I'll give you an address. Once I receive the ghost shark's blood, I'll send you the formula or tell it to you directly here. As for guarantees, I think we can both trust the mysterious Sir to be our witness." At this, Alger glanced at Joe Mingrui, who sat upright in the seat of honor. "Sir, you brought us here, demonstrating unimaginable power. Neither of us would dare to break a promise under your watch." "That's right," Audrey agreed enthusiastically. From her perspective, the mysterious gentleman with such incredible abilities was the ultimate witness. Neither she nor Alger could possibly deceive him. Audrey turned halfway and looked at Joe Mingrui earnestly. "Sir, please be the witness to our trade." In that moment, she realized she had been impolite, having forgotten to ask an important question. She hurriedly added, "Sir, how should we address you?" Alger nodded slightly, echoing the same question seriously. "Sir, how should we address you?" Joe Mingrui was caught off guard. He gently rapped his fingers on the bronze table, recalling the earlier divination. He leaned back, crossed his fingers, and gave the two of them a faint smile. "You can address me as—" He paused for a moment before continuing, his voice calm and composed. "The Fool. You can address me as the Fool." The simple answer echoed through the grand hall, dissipating into the fog. Yet, the voice lingered in Audrey's and Alger's hearts, stirring ripples of thought. They hadn't expected such a designation, but somehow it felt right. The name embodied the mysterious, powerful, and bizarre image of the man before them. After a few moments of silence, Audrey stood up, lifted her skirt slightly, and bent her knees in a graceful curtsy. "Honorable Mr. Fool, may I take the liberty of requesting you to witness our trade?" "It's nothing," Joe Mingrui replied smoothly, his mind racing to match the gravity of his new role. "It's our honor, Mr. Fool." Alger stood as well, bending slightly with his right palm over his chest. Joe Mingrui lowered his hand, smiling. "Continue, both of you." Alger nodded, sat back down, and turned to Audrey. "If you can obtain the ghost shark's blood, have someone deliver it to the Warrior and Sea Bar at Pelican Street, White Rose Borough, in Pritz Harbor. Tell the boss, Williams, that it's for the captain. Once I confirm receipt, would you prefer I mail the potion formula to an address, or would you like me to relay it to you directly here?" Audrey thought for a moment, then smiled. "I'll choose the more secure method. Let's meet here again. It'll be a test of my memory." Since Mr. Fool had agreed to witness their trade, Audrey assumed there would be another gathering in the future. The trio at the long table came from different backgrounds, with varied resources and knowledge of the mystical domain. By cooperating, they could achieve unpredictable and immeasurable results. The resource trade they had just negotiated was one example. Another might be a discreet request for help, such as eliminating a target without leaving a trace. A young lady of lofty stature. Was my behavior that obvious? Audrey blinked, momentarily startled. She quickly recovered and nodded. "Mr. Fool, I think it's a great suggestion. If this gathering becomes regular, you can leave certain tasks to us, as long as it's within our capabilities." From the moment Alger had spoken, Joe Mingrui had been weighing the pros and cons. More gatherings meant gaining knowledge about the Beyonders and other mysteries, crucial for his chances of returning home. For example, he might soon acquire the Spectator Potion formula, which could be useful in his current situation. Suddenly her eyes sparkled with interest, and she turned to Joe Mingrui. "Mr. Fool, would you mind making more attempts like this?" Alger, tempted by the suggestion, quickly echoed, "Mr. Fool, don't you find such gatherings interesting? Though your powers surpass our imagination, there may be areas where we can be of assistance. The person across from me is clearly a young lady of high status. I have my own set of unique experiences, insights, and resources. Perhaps one day we could help you accomplish something that may be inconvenient for you." In Alger's mind, the fact that he had been pulled into this space without any warning meant that Mr. Fool was in full control. Participation in future gatherings seemed inevitable, so it was better to extract as much benefit as possible. However, the more they gathered, the greater the risk of exposure. Indeed, there's no such thing as a free lunch in any world. Joe Mingrui tapped his finger gently against the table, considering the matter. Since he controlled the summoning and dismissal of the gatherings, the risks of exposure remained within his control. The benefits clearly outweighed the risks, so he made his decision. He stopped tapping the table and smiled at the eager, slightly nervous faces before him. I'm someone who values fair and equal exchanges. Your help will not go unrewarded. Every Monday at 3 in the afternoon, do your best to be alone. After I make a few more attempts and sort a few things out, you may even be able to request leave in advance to avoid awkward situations. This was his way of agreeing to their suggestion. Audrey, who had just turned 17, couldn't hide her excitement. She clenched her fists slightly and pumped them in front of her chest. Before Alger could say anything, she burst out excitedly, "Shall we give ourselves code names? We can't use our real names in these conversations after all. While I may not be able to deceive Mr. Fool, the man across from me is dangerous. He must not learn who I am." "Good idea," Zhou Mingrui replied simply. Audrey's mind whirred as she spoke her thoughts aloud. "You are Mr. Fool, based on tarot cards. Since this is a long-term, secretive gathering, we should all adopt names from the tarot." Her tone became joyful. "I've decided I'll be Justice. It was one of the 22 major arcana tarot cards. And you, sir?" Audrey smiled playfully at Alger. Alger frowned slightly but quickly relaxed. "I'll be the Hanged Man, another major arcana card." "All right then, we're the founding members of the Tarot Club," Audrey said with a burst of happiness, then quickly glanced at Zhou Mingrui, unsure. "Will that be all right, Mr. Fool?" Zhou Mingrui smiled and shook his head in amusement. "You can decide on such trivial matters." "Thank you," Audrey beamed, clearly thrilled. She then turned to Alger. "Mr. Hanged Man, could you repeat the address one more time? I don't want to forget it." "No problem." Alger repeated the address, pleased with her seriousness. Audrey repeated it to herself 3 times before saying, "I've heard that tarot cards were invented by Emperor Roselle as a game. But don't they also have the power to divine the future?" "No. Most divination comes from within. Everyone has a spiritual connection to the world, but most people are unable to perceive or interpret it. Divination tools like tarot cards help reveal and interpret these spiritual signs. It's similar to dreams and dream interpreters." Alger glanced at Zhou Mingrui, who remained silent, then continued, "Tarot cards are simply a tool, using symbolism and logic to help us interpret the signs more accurately." Zhou Mingrui appeared indifferent, but he was listening closely. His head began to throb as his once clear mind grew heavier. "Got it," Audrey nodded. "But that's not what I meant. I heard Emperor Roselle created another set of secret cards, mysterious ones. They were said to symbolize an unknown power, and there were only 22 of them. Later, he based the major arcana tarot cards on these. Is that true?" She looked to Zhou Mingrui, hoping for an answer. Zhou Mingrui only smiled without speaking, turning his gaze toward the Hanged Man. Alger straightened up and spoke in a deep voice. "That's right. It said Emperor Roselle saw the blasphemy slate, and that set of cards contained the profound mysteries of the 22 paths of the divine." 22 paths of the divine, Audrey repeated softly, a note of longing in her voice. At that moment, Zhou Mingrui's headache intensified. His connection with the crimson stars and the grayish-white fog began to weaken. "That's enough for today's gathering," he announced in a deep voice, making a swift decision. "By your will," Alger replied, bowing his head respectfully. "By your will," Audrey mimicked. She still had so many questions, so much left to explore. She was disappointed that it had to end so soon. As Zhou Mingrui severed the connection, he smiled. "Let's look forward to the next gathering." The stars brightened once more as the crimson light receded like water. As Audrey and Alger heard Mr. Fool's words, their figures became blurry and then disappeared altogether. In an instant, the projection shattered, and the gray fog returned to its silent state. Zhou Mingrui felt his body grow heavy, his surroundings becoming faint before his eyes met the dazzling sunlight. He was back in his apartment. It was like a dream. What was that foggy world? What kind of power created those changes? Zhou Mingrui muttered to himself, confused. He walked toward the study desk, his legs feeling heavy. He picked up his pocket watch to check how much time had passed. Time flowed at the same pace. He made a rough judgment. Unable to endure the splitting headache any longer, he sat down and massaged his temples with his thumb and middle finger. After a long moment, he sighed softly and said, "From the looks of it, I won't be able to return anytime soon." The more he learned about Beyonders and the mystical world, the less he dared to recklessly attempt the luck enhancement ritual again. Who knew what other strange or terrifying situations might arise? At the very least, I should wait until I've mastered mysticism, Joe Mingrui thought helplessly. Thankfully, the gatherings might provide him with the help he needed. After another moment of silence, he muttered with dismay, disappointment, and grief, "From this moment on, I'm Klein." Klein refocused on his plans, purging his negative emotions. Perhaps at the next gathering, he could learn the potion formula for Spectator. The gathering was truly fascinating. People scattered across the world, connected in an instant, discussing and trading in secret. Klein paused, a sudden realization dawning on him. This feels oddly familiar. He stared blankly for a second, then burst out laughing. Pressing a hand to his temple, he whispered to himself, "Isn't this just like a social networking platform?" After taking a breath, Joe Mingrui took off his suit and vest, switching to a brownish-yellow coat. He also changed to a felt hat with a rounded edge of the same color. With his outfit done, he walked to the side of the bed and lifted a square cushion. He reached his hand into an inconspicuous hole beneath and rummaged around before finding an intermediate layer. When he retracted his right hand, there was a roll of notes in his palm. There were about 8 notes with faded dark green colors. These were all the savings Benson had at the moment. It even included the living expenses for the next 3 days. 2 of them were 5 solely notes, and the remaining were 1 solely notes. In the Lowen Kingdom's currency system, solely was ranked second. It originated from ancient silver coins. 1 solely was equivalent to 12 copper pence. They had denominations of 1 and 5 solely. At the top of the currency system was the gold pound. They were also paper-based, but were guaranteed by gold and pegged directly. A gold pound was equivalent to 20 solely. They had denominations of 1, 5, and 10 gold pounds. Joe Mingrui spread a note and caught a whiff of the faint, unique ink. This was the smell of money. Perhaps as a result of Klein's memory fragments or his constant desire for money, Joe Mingrui felt like he had instantly fallen in love with these notes. Look, their designs are so beautiful. It makes the stern and old-fashioned George III and his 2 mustaches appear especially adorable. Look, the watermark that can be seen when the note is placed against sunlight is so alluring. The exquisite design for the anti-counterfeit label makes it completely different from those fake, fancy schlocks. Joe Mingrui admired it for nearly a minute before pulling out 2 1 solely notes. He then rolled up the remaining notes and stuffed them back into the cushion's concealed layer. After arranging and flattening the cloth around the hole, Joe Mingrui folded the 2 notes he had taken out neatly and placed them into the left pocket of his brownish-yellow jacket. He separated the notes from the few pence he had in his trouser pocket. With all of this done, he placed a key into his right pocket, brought a dark brownish paper bag along with him, and quickly walked toward the door. His shuffling footsteps slowed down from a brisk pace until they eventually stopped. Zhou Mingrui stood by the door, unsure when he had already begun to frown. Klein's suicide was fraught with peculiarities. Would he encounter any accidents if he were to leave just like that? After some deep thought, Zhou Mingrui returned to his desk and pulled open the drawer. He then took out the shimmering brass revolver. This was the only defensive weapon he could think of, and it was the only weapon with sufficient power. Although he had never practiced shooting, just pulling such a revolver out would definitely daunt anyone. He caressed the revolver's cold metal before stuffing it into the pocket where his notes were. He clasped the money in his palm as his fingers pressed onto the gun's handle. It was perfectly concealed. This was the only defensive weapon he could think of, and it was the only weapon with sufficient power. Although he had never practiced shooting, just pulling such a revolver out would definitely daunt anyone. He caressed the revolver's cold metal before stuffing it into the pocket where his notes were. He clasped the money in his palm as his fingers pressed onto the gun's handle. It was perfectly concealed. Feeling secure, he who knew a little of everything suddenly had a worry. Would I end up misfiring? Being deluged with such a thought, Zhou Mingrui quickly thought of a solution. He drew the revolver and released the cylinder. He then aligned the empty chamber, which was a result of the suicide, along the gun's hammer before closing it. This way, even if there was a misfire, he would discharge an empty round. After stuffing the revolver back into his pocket, Zhou Mingrui kept his left hand in there. He pressed down on his hat with his right hand and pulled open the door before leaving. The corridor during the day remained dim as limited sunlight shone in from the window situated at the end of the corridor. Zhou Mingrui quickly went down the stairs and left the apartment before taking in the brilliance and warmth of the sun. Although it was almost July, it was still considered the middle of summer. However, Tingen was situated north of the Loan Kingdom, so it had unique climate characteristics. The highest annual temperature was not even 30 degrees Celsius on Earth, with even cooler mornings. However, the streets were awash with filthy water and strewn junk. From Klein's memories, this was not a rare sight in low-income communities, even if there were sewers. After all, there were just too many people, and people needed to survive. Come and try our delicious roasted fish, hot and fresh oyster soup. Drink a bowl in the morning and feel invigorated all day. Fresh fish from the port for just 5 pence apiece. Muffins and eel soup make the perfect combination. Conch, conch, conch. Vegetables freshly plucked from the farms outside the city, cheap and fresh. The mobile hawkers who sold vegetables, fruits, and hot food shouted along the streets as they beckoned the rushing pedestrians. Some of them would stop and carefully compare before purchasing. Others would impatiently wave their hands as they had yet to find work for the day. Zhou Mingrui took in a whiff of the air that mixed both noxious and fragrant aromas. As he clenched the revolver tightly in his left hand, he held the notes tight. He pressed down on his hat with his right hand while passing through the busy street, slouching a little. Chapter 9. The Notebook. After half an hour of rest, Zhou Minggrui, who now viewed himself as Klein, finally recovered. In the meantime, he found that there were now 4 black dots on the back of his hand, which happened to form a small square. These 4 black spots faded and disappeared quickly, but Klein knew that they were still hiding in his body, waiting to be awakened. 4 spots forming a square. Is it in correspondence with the 4 pieces of staple food at the 4 corners of the room? Does this mean that in the future, I don't need to prepare the food and can do the ritual and chants immediately? Klein made a guess. This might seem good, but the emergence of the spots was ominous, and things that one lacked understanding of were always scary. The fact that those inexplicable Chinese divinations from Earth could produce effects here, the strange transmigration in his sleep, the mysterious murmurings that almost drove him crazy during the ritual, and the mysterious and trippy gray world whose significance he had no idea of made Klein shiver in the hot weather of June. The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest fear is the fear of the unknown. He recalled this saying as he was experiencing the fear of the unknown acutely. There was in him an unprecedented and irresistible urge to make contact with the mysterious domain, to learn more, and to explore the unknown. There was also a contradicting escape mentality within him, compelling him to pretend nothing had happened. Intense sunlight shone through the window onto the desk, making it appear as if grains of gold were sprinkled on it. Klein gazed at the desk, feeling as though he had come into contact with warmth and hope. He relaxed slightly, and a strong sense of fatigue washed over him. His eyelids were as heavy as lead as they kept closing themselves. It must have been the combined effect of the sleepless night and the tiring encounter. Klein shook his head and pushed himself up with the aid of the desk. He stumbled towards the double-decked bed, completely disregarding the rye bread placed at the 4 corners of the room. He fell asleep immediately after he lay down. Groan, groan. Klein was woken up by hunger pangs. When he opened his eyes, he felt rejuvenated. There's still a slight headache. He rubbed his temples and sat up. He was so hungry that he could eat a horse. He returned to the desk while straightening his shirt. He picked up the silver vine-leaf pocket watch. Pa! The pocket watch's lid sprang open, and the second hand was ticking. 12:30. I slept for 3 hours. Klein put the pocket watch back into his linen shirt pocket while swallowing. In the northern continent, there were 24 hours in a day, 60 minutes in an hour, and 60 seconds in a minute. Whether each second passed at the same rate here compared to Earth was unknown to Klein. At this moment, he could not even think of terms such as mysticism, rituals, or the grayish world. His mind was occupied by one thing: food. He would leave thinking after his meals. Only then could he work. Klein picked up the loaves of rye bread from the 4 corners and wiped off the minute specks of dust on it without any hesitation. He planned on making one of them his lunch. He decided to dig into the offerings because he only had 5 pence with him, and there was a tradition of eating the offerings back in his hometown. After all, there was not any observable change to the bread. It was better to be frugal. Of course, the memory and habits left behind by the original Klein had also played a role. It was a huge waste to use the expensive gas only to light up the room. So Klein took out a furnace and boiled water with it after adding some coal. He paced around as he waited. Anyone would choke eating those loaves of rye bread without water. Yikes, life with meat only for dinner is going to be dreadful. No, wait, this is already an exception. Melissa would only allow our meals to have meat twice a week if not for my upcoming interview, Klein thought as he looked around, hungry. He had nothing better to do. His eyes seemed to turn avaricious when he set his eyes on the pound of mutton in the cupboard. No, I need to wait for Melissa to eat it together, Klein thought, as he shook his head and rejected the idea of cooking half of it right now. Although he often ate outside, he had still developed some basic culinary skills, owing to his living in a big city alone. His dishes were not delicious, but they were at least edible. Klein turned his body around so that the mutton would not seduce him. Then he suddenly realized that he had also bought peas and potatoes in the morning. Potatoes! Klein immediately had an idea. He quickly turned back to the cupboard and took out 2 potatoes from a tiny pile of them. He first cleaned the potatoes in the public bathroom and then added them into a pot so they were boiled together with the water. After a while, he sprinkled into the water some yellow coarse salt from the spices container he found inside the cupboard. He waited patiently for a few minutes before lifting the pot and pouring the soup into a few cups in a bowl. He took out the potatoes with a fork and placed them on the desk at the end. He blew at the potato as he peeled it bit by bit. The fragrance of boiled potato diffused through the air. It smelled very appetizing. He salivated crazily. The heat could not deter him any longer. Klein took a bite despite having the potato only half peeled. How fragrant! It had a powdery texture and tasted sweet as he chewed. He was instantly filled with emotions, and he wolfed down the 2 potatoes. He even ate some of the skin. Then he held up the bowl and enjoyed the soup. The pinch of salt and water proved to be thirst-quenching. I really enjoyed eating potatoes this way when I was young. A filled Klein exclaimed in his head. Meanwhile, he tore off a small piece of bread and dipped it into the soup to soften it before eating. Perhaps the ritual was too tiring. Klein ate 2 loaves of bread, which amounted to a whole pound. Klein felt he was finally rejuvenated. He enjoyed the joy of life after he drank the soup before tidying up. Then he took in the lustrous sunshine happily. He sat back at the desk and began planning. I can't escape. I must think of a way to come into contact with mysticism and become a beyonder, as mentioned by Justice and the Hanged Man. I need to overcome the fear of the unknown. The only way now is to wait for the next gathering. I need to see if I can learn the formula of the spectator potion or other things related to mysticism. There are 4 more days before Monday. Before that, I need to first figure out the problem with Klein. Why did he commit suicide? What happened to him? Unable to transmigrate back and wash his hands of everything, Klein picked up the notebook that lay on the table. He wanted to find hints that could help him regain his lost memory fragments. The original Klein obviously had the habit of taking notes. He also liked to write diaries. Klein was fully aware that the cabinet that supported the desk, on the right, stored a whole stack of completed notebooks. The book he had began on the 10th of May. Matters regarding his school and mentor, as well as content pertaining to knowledge, were at the beginning. The 12th of May. Mr. Azik mentioned that the common language used by the Balam Empire in the southern continent also developed from ancient Faisak, a branch of Jotun. Why is this so? Does this mean that every sentient living being once spoke the same language? No, there has to be a mistake. According to the Revelation of Evernight and the Book of Storms, giants were not the only hegemons of the world in primordial times. There were also elves, mutants, and dragons. Anyways, these are just myths and fantasies. The 16th of May. Senior Associate Professor Cohen and Mr. Azik discussed the inevitability of the Age of Steam. Mr. Azik opined that it was just a coincidence because if it wasn't for Emperor Roselle, the northern continent would still be wielding swords like the southern continent. Mentor argued that Mr. Azik had placed too much emphasis on the contribution of an individual. He believes that with progress, even if there wasn't an Emperor Roselle, there would be an Emperor Robert. Therefore, the Age of Steam might come late, but eventually come nevertheless. I found little meaning in their discussion. I prefer discovering new things and unraveling the hidden past. Perhaps I am more suited to study archaeology than history. The 29th of May. Welch found me and told me that he had acquired a notebook from the 4th epoch. Oh my goddess, a notebook from the 4th epoch. He didn't want to ask the archaeology department students for help, so he came to Naya and me to help him decode the contents. How can I refuse? Of course, I can only do it after my graduation defense. I can't afford to divert my attention at this stage. This caught Klein's attention. Compared to the notes about history and viewpoint disagreements, the appearance of a notebook from the 4th epoch might have led to Klein's suicide. The 4th epoch was the epoch before the present Iron Age. Its history was mysterious and incomplete. Due to the fact that very few tombs, ancient cities, and records had been found, archaeologists and historians could only refer to the ambiguous records provided by the 7 major churches that centered around their religious teachings to roughly form the original picture. They knew the existence of the Solomon Empire, the Tudor dynasty, and the Trunsoist Empire. Having set his sights on solving the mystery and restoring history, Klein didn't have much interest in the first three eras, whose roots were closer to legends. He was more interested in the fourth epoch, also known as the Age of the Gods. So Klein was concerned for his future career and thus focused on the interview. But it was all futile. Klein could not resist exclaiming, universities were still very scarce, and the majority of students were either from noble or wealthy families. As long as he did not have an extreme mindset, a commoner who had been admitted into university would have been able to build precious social connections through group discussions and networking events, despite the prejudice and exclusion from the entrenched social circles. The very generous Welch McGovern was an example. He was the son of a banker from Constant City, Mid-Seashire, Lowen Kingdom. He was used to asking Naya and Klein for help because they were always in the same group for work. Without thinking further, Klein continued reading the notebook. The 18th of June, I have graduated. Farewell, Coy University. The 19th of June, I have seen the notebook. By comparing sentence structures and root words, I discovered that it is a modified form of ancient Faesac. More precisely, over the course of its 1,000-year history, the Faesac language had changed constantly, a little at a time. The 20th of June, we have deciphered the contents of the first page. The author was a member of a family called Antigonus. The 21st of June, he mentioned the Black Emperor. This is anachronistic with regards to the time this notebook is deduced to be written. Is Professor wrong? Is Black Emperor a common title for every emperor of the Solomon Empire? The 22nd of June, the Antigonus family apparently had a very high standing in the Solomon Empire. The author mentions that he was making a secret transaction with a person named Tudor. Tudor, is it related to the Tudor dynasty? The 23rd of June. I'm trying to restrain myself from thinking about the notebook and going to Welch's place. I need to prepare for the interview. It's very important. The 24th of June. Naya tells me that they have found something new. I think I need to check it out. The 25th of June. From the new deciphered content, the author had accepted a mission to visit the nation of the Evernite, situated at the summit of the highest peak of the Hornachus mountain range. Oh my goddess! How can a nation exist at the summit of that peak, which is over 6,000 meters above sea level? How do they survive? The 26th of June. Are these strange things real? The record ended at this point. Joe Mingrui transmigrated in the early hours of the 28th, which means to say that there was indeed an entry for June 27th. It's that line. Everyone will die, including me. Klein flipped to the page he first saw when he arrived, feeling goosebumps while he made the deduction. In order to solve the mystery of the original Klein suicide, he thought that he should visit Welch and take a look at the ancient notebook. However, with a lot of experience from novels, movies, and TV drama series, he suspected that if they were really related, this visit would be very dangerous. Those who went investigating castles, despite knowing that they were haunted, served as a warning. However, he had to go since escaping would never solve the problem. It would only make things worse until it welled over and completely drowned him. Perhaps call the police, but claiming to have committed suicide would be silly, right? Knock, knock, knock. There was a series of quick and forceful knocks. Klein sat straight up and listened. Knock, knock, knock. The knocks echoed through the empty hallway. Who is it? Klein was thinking about the mysterious suicide of the original owner of this body and the unknown danger he might encounter when he heard the sudden knock on the door. He subconsciously opened the drawer, took out the revolver, and asked cautiously. The other party was quiet for 2 seconds before a slightly sharp voice in Alva's accent replied, "It's me, Mountbatten, bitch Mountbatten." The voice paused for a moment before adding, "The police, bitch Mountbatten." When Klein heard the name, he immediately recognized him. He was the policeman in charge of the street where the apartment was located. A rude, brutal, hands-on man. But perhaps only such a man could be a deterrent for alcoholics, thieves, part-time thieves, villains, and hooligans. And his distinct voice was one of his trademarks. "Okay, I'll be right there," Klein responded loudly. He had planned to put the revolver back into the drawer, but considering he had no idea why the police were outside, and fearing they might search the room, he cautiously ran to the stove where the flames had already been extinguished. He placed the revolver in it, then picked up the coal basket, shook a few pieces into the stove, covered the gun, and finally set the kettle on top to conceal everything. After doing all of that, he tidied his clothes and quickly approached the door, murmuring, "Sorry, I just had a nap." Outside the door stood 4 policemen in black and white checkered uniforms with peaked caps. Bitch Mountbatten, the one with a brown beard, coughed and said to Klein, "These 3 inspectors have something to ask you." "Inspectors?" Klein glanced at the shoulder badges of the 3 men and noticed that 2 of them had 3 silver hexagons and 1 had 2, indicating a rank superior to Bitch Mountbatten's 3 chevrons. As a history student, Klein had done little research into police ranks, except that Bitch Mountbatten often boasted of being a senior sergeant. So these are inspectors? Influenced by his conversations with Benson, Welch, and his classmates, Klein had the common sense to make way and point into the room. "Please come in. How might I help you?" The leader of the 3 inspectors was a middle-aged man with sharp eyes. He seemed able to read minds, evoking fear. His eyes were wrinkled, and light brown hair peeked out from under his hat. He looked around the room and asked in a deep voice, "Do you know Welch McGovern?" "What's wrong with him?" Klein quivered and blurted back. "I'm the one asking the questions," the middle-aged inspector said sternly. The inspector next to him, also with 3 silver hexagons, smiled gently at Klein. "Don't be nervous, it's just a routine questioning." This policeman was in his 30s, with a straight nose and gray eyes, giving him an indescribable sense of depth, like a calm, ancient forest lake. Klein took a breath and organized his words. "If you mean Welch McGovern, the graduate of Coy University from Constant, then yes, I know him. We were classmates, both mentored by Senior Associate Professor Quentin Cohen." Klein paused, then added, "To be honest, our relationship is quite good. I met with him and Naya recently to decode and discuss a 4th epic notebook he had acquired. Inspectors, did something happen to him?" Instead of answering, the middle-aged inspector glanced sideways at his gray-eyed colleague. The gray-eyed inspector replied mildly, "I'm sorry, Mr. Welch has passed away." "What?" Despite his earlier hunch, Klein couldn't help but shout in astonishment. "Welch died too? Just like the original owner of this body? That's terrifying." "What about Naya?" Klein asked hurriedly. "Miss Naya passed away as well," the gray-eyed inspector said calmly. "Both of them were found dead at Mr. Welch's house." "Killed?" Klein asked, already suspecting the answer. The gray-eyed inspector shook his head. "No, the scene suggests they committed suicide. Mr. Welch repeatedly struck his head against the wall, covering it with blood. Miss Naya drowned herself in a basin. Yes, the kind used to wash your face." "That's impossible." Klein's hairs stood on end as he imagined the strange scene. A girl kneeling on a chair, face submerged in a basin of water, her soft brown hair swaying slightly, while her body remained still. Welch, collapsed on the floor, staring blankly at the ceiling, his forehead a bloody mess, the impact traces evident on the wall. The gray-eyed inspector continued, "We believe so too, but the autopsy results and the scene suggest no drugs or external forces. Both Mr. Welch and Miss Naya showed no signs of struggle." Before Klein could respond, the inspector stepped into the room, pretending to be casual. "When was the last time you saw Mr. Welch or Miss Naya?" As he spoke, the gray-eyed inspector gestured to his colleague with 2 silver hexagons, who began scanning the room. And Klein thought for a moment and answered, "It was June 26th. We were deciphering a new chapter in the notes. Afterward, I went home to prepare for my June 30th interview. It was for the history department of Tingen University." The young inspector began walking toward Klein's desk and picked up a notebook that resembled a diary. "Damn, I forgot to hide it." "Hey!" Klein cried out, but the young inspector merely smiled and continued flipping through it. The gray-eyed inspector said calmly, "This is a necessary procedure." Bitch Mountbatten and the middle-aged inspector remained silent, merely observing. "Where are your search warrants?" Klein thought, but quickly remembered that the Lowen Kingdom's judicial system probably didn't have such a thing. Klein watched helplessly as the inspector flipped through his notes. The gray-eyed inspector remained quiet, offering no questions. "What is this strange entry?" the young inspector asked suddenly, his voice serious. "And what does it mean? Everyone will die, including me? Isn't it obvious that everyone dies except for gods?" Klein considered playing dumb, but realized this was his chance to get the police involved in his situation. In less than a second, he decided to act. Placing a hand on his forehead, he said with pained sincerity, "I have no idea. When I woke up this morning, something felt wrong, like I had forgotten something important. I don't even remember why I wrote that line." Sometimes being straightforward is the best way to handle a problem. Of course, it requires finesse. There are things that should and shouldn't be said. As a seasoned keyboard warrior, Klein knew how to weave a convincing tale. "Ridiculous. Do you take us for fools?" Bitch Mountbatten interjected angrily. The lie insulted his intelligence. "I'm telling the truth," Klein insisted, looking Mountbatten and the middle-aged inspector squarely in the eye. "It couldn't be more true." "Perhaps it is," the gray-eyed inspector said slowly. "What? He believed me?" Klein was shocked. The inspector smiled slightly. "An expert will visit in 2 days. She should be able to help you recall your lost memories." "An expert? Someone to help me remember? Psychology?" Klein frowned, feeling uneasy. What if his memories of Earth were revealed? The young inspector finished scanning Klein's desk, but didn't lift the kettle. "Well, Mr. Klein, thank you for your cooperation. We advise you not to leave Tingen for the next few days. If you must, inform Inspector Mountbatten. Otherwise, you'll be considered a fugitive." "That's it? No further questions?" Klein was surprised, but nodded. "Understood." As the inspectors left, the young man at the back patted Klein on the shoulder. "You're very lucky," he said. "What?" Klein asked, confused. The inspector smiled. "Normally, in cases like this, everyone dies. We're fortunate you're still alive." On this June afternoon, Klein felt a chill creep over him.